ora, Red, and welcome, and thank you for agreeing to take part in our 10 for 10 podcast series.
Kia ora, Robin. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So we'll start with a bit of whakawhanaangatanga. Tell me a bit about who you are, where you're from, and your family, the people who shaped you.
I think arguably the two most important lines in my bio is that I'm a long-suffering Warriors fan and I'm a proud disabled person. But beyond those two kind of critical tentpole features of my identity and who I am, yeah, I was born and raised here in Tāmaki Makaurau, and now I reside in the glorious suburban paradise of Te Aratū South. So I'm a Westie, and I live there with my wife and our three boys who are currently aged 9 and 7 and 3. But 19, 17 and 13 doesn't feel that far away, given their disposition. And we also live with my wife's parents, who live with us in a kind of a multi-generational living situation. And proud to call Tāmaki Makaurau home. It's an amazing place to kind of grow up, and you get exposed to so many different kind of things and people and ideas and spaces and conversations. And I feel really fortunate actually to be. I know Auckland doesn't get a very good rap, but I love it. I love it.
Yeah, I'm in Auckland. I'm a South Islander, but I'm an Auckland convert. But I get a hard time when the temperature drops below 20 and I need, put on a woolly jumper. So growing up in Auckland and that experience, one of the things that several interviewees have mentioned is that experience of going from the sort of confines of family out into the world for the first time through going to primary school and then later into secondary school and seeing how different other people's lives were and how you fit in. What was that process like for you?
You mean the process of going through school?
Yeah, of that movement out of the confines of family into the wider world.
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? Like I think those sort of teenage years are, you're so, just because of your biology and your brain, you're so kind of self involved. Everyone's looking at you and how bad your pimples are today, or what whether you're wearing the right fashion. And I think growing up as a young disabled person, that experience is magnified and concentrated in different ways. And so I think you're trying to figure out what it means to exist in the world in my case, as a wheelchair user, as someone with a very visible disability. And then how do you relate to other people? How do you both figure out who you are as a person, but also in relationship with other people? And especially when, in my context, I don't have any other disabled people in my family. And so you're kind of figuring it out all by yourself, coupled with this kind of quite pervasive and quite ableist notion that we don't want young disabled people mixing with older disabled people, because we all want the best for our kids, right? We want the best for our rangatahi, and sometimes there is this kind of misguided notion that you don't want to hang out with those older, slightly more grisly, slightly more bitter, withered, cynical, disabled people, because they might poison your ideas about what success looks like or what your life could look like. So as a result, I think growing up, I had quite a you sort of and this is quite a common experience amongst my peer group of disabled people, is that we really tried to be, to use quite a crass expression, as normal as possible. So you tried to minimize your disability. You tried to, do things in such a way that people would find remarkable or inspiring or in some way impressive, and unwittingly playing into all of those stereotypes that now in my work we try and unravel. But at the time, you're just trying to create something of yourself outside what were some pretty grim kind of stereotypes and ideas about what it meant to be a disabled person growing up in the 90s. So yeah, I mean, it's a really long answer to your question, but it was a really interesting experience, I think, trying to find, yeah, who you are as someone who is so visibly kind of experienced the world in a very different way, and then how you relate to other people. And, when home, I mean, my parents were both really supportive in their own ways, and so were my siblings, but they didn't really understand what it meant to experience life as a disabled person, and therefore, couldn't always offer the kind of advice that I might have needed. But maybe that's just part of the journey, right? Maybe that's just part of the journey. But I look back on the stuff that I used to do as a disabled young person, and I'm like, how did I ever have the energy for that? Like I'd be out till 3 in the morning in the city, and then I'd drive my wheelchair home again. I wouldn't even catch public transport. I'd just drive it home. Like it's outrageous. And yet there's something about being young, I think, that you do think you're bulletproof, even if you're driving a power wheelchair around. So there's a certain magic quality about that. And I would never do half the things now that I did when I was 18, 19, 20. So there's a degree of I'm kind of impressed looking back that I somehow managed to find the courage and/or absurd notion that it was okay to do half the things that I did as a young person, and that's kind of cool as well.
One of the questions that I've got came up originally in some leadership interviews I did with people for CSI some time ago, and it was about asking who was the first person outside of their sort of immediate family circle who made them feel seen, who made them feel that they were somebody in the world. Was there somebody for you that made that difference?
Yeah, definitely. The person that springs to mind, and he's kind of always been someone I come back to when I'm feeling uncertain about things, or I'm feeling, untethered in some way. And it's and a very old one of my oldest friends, Philip Paxton, and he's another disabled person. He actually has the same condition as me, cerebral palsy, but he's probably I don't want to be unkind to the guy. He's probably 20 or 30 years my senior. But what that has meant is that at various points in my life, he's provided wisdom, advice, guidance, mentorship, in a really unique way that I don't think many folks outside disability spaces are capable of doing. So one of the kind of more formative occasions of this was this time that I was over at his house, and he was drinking wine, as he is wont to do on occasion, and he was drinking it out of a straw. And at the time, just to kind of back to my earlier point, I was so obsessed with trying to appear as non-disabled as possible, even though I get around in a wheelchair, and so you kind of the force is bolted. But in any case, I was like, well, I can't use a straw to drink my wine because then everyone will know that I have a disability. But so that, as absurd as that sounds, that was very much the kind of mentality. And when you're trying to do things as normally as possible, using a straw is something of an admission of defeat, right? But here was this guy in his prime, and this, he was such an amazing man, and he was an architect of so many amazing creative ideas, and he was drinking wine out of a straw. And I kind of, in that moment, I remember it going, oh, that's quite cool, like that's quite badass, and that's quite unapologetic, about who you are and what you need to be in the world. And sometimes that looks like a straw with your red wine. But I really kind of held on to that as a bit of like something to aspire to. Like I hope that one day I too can be comfortable enough in my skin and in my identity and in my place in the world that I won't feel like, asking for a straw for my glass of wine is in somehow diminishing my mana, or my sense of self. So yeah, I mean, there are so many examples that Philip has provided me over the years, but that was certainly that first time I saw that straw in that glass of wine, I was like, that's what success looks like. One day that'll be me.
Gosh, the luck in life when you run into those people who somehow make you feel whole and seen, and all those sorts of things. So leaving school, you ended up teaching. What informed that choice, and what was it like?
Well, the dream was, so I'm a really big fan of this radio duo called Fletch and Vaughan. And I've always been a fan of those two lads. They're funny. They are, I think they break the mold of stereotypical New Zealand masculinity, and I quite like that. Um, and they're just really cool kind of characters. And so my dream was to be on the radio just like Fletch and Vaughan. So I did comms at AUT, and I did my radio major, and I was all set to go and fulfill my dream of working in the radio. But I spent a little bit of time in the radio industry, and I realized very quickly that it wasn't quite a place that I thought it could have been for me. And that's a whole nother conversation. But anyway, needless to say, I spent some time reevaluating my life choices, and I've always really enjoyed working with young people. And my dad's a teacher, and I think for other people listening who have teachers in their families, there is this kind of thing that happens where if your parents are a teacher, I don't know what the official statistics are. Maybe they don't exist, but I reckon there's a reasonable likelihood that you too will one day land in the classroom. So yeah. But and I was 25 at the time, which on reflection was probably maybe a little bit too young. But sometimes, when you're that age, not all the decisions you make in life are necessarily carefully planned and thought out. But suffice to say, come 2011, I was at Teachers College, and then I spent a glorious 8 years at Onehunga High School teaching English and media studies. And I loved it. I just loved it. There was something about, there was a pinch myself moment in that first year of teaching where I kind of couldn't believe they let me because I'd never seen a teacher in a wheelchair before, and I wasn't even sure if I could do the job. And I wasn't sure how the kids would react. I was really sort of unsure about that. But I knew that if I kind of stuck at it, that I'd do all right. Because I think fundamentally teaching is about relationships, and it's about caring about young people and having high expectations of young people. And my experience of school certainly was that we didn't always have high expectations of students with disabilities. We'd let them kind of, I was often allowed to not do my homework or not hand in an assignment or whatever because teachers just didn't expect me to do as well as my peers in my class. So I sort of quickly realized actually that what my students at Onehunga were looking for was a teacher who would hold them accountable, that would have high expectations of them. And I kind of thought maybe there'd be more of a, I don't know, maybe they'd be really like either freak out that their teacher's in a wheelchair or be quite impressed. And it was neither of those actually. Like what surprised me was just how little it mattered to my students that their teacher used a wheelchair. But I loved my time at OHS. I still keep in touch with some of the students that I taught there. And I think what my time as a high school teacher taught me more than anything was the extent to which systems can perpetuate kind of negative educational outcomes, and more broadly, how systems can perpetuate the status quo. I went into teaching to try and be part of the change, right? To kind of shift things in a particular direction to because when you study things like the impact of low expectations, for example, on Māori and Pacific students, you go into teaching with a sense that you can start to shift those outcomes and shift those statistics. But what I kind of learned is that it's really interesting how quickly you can kind of become complicit in those spaces. So despite all the best of my intentions and a really fundamentally relational approach, it was really hard to not become caught up in the way those systems operate, and again, there's some detail we could go into around that stuff, but it was just it really struck me by the time that I left just how much I was kind of becoming a cog in the wheel of the system that I was trying to change. And I think we all have a responsibility to continue to reflect on to what extent are we being that agent of change that we seek to do in social change spaces, and to what extent are we replicating some of those patterns and some of those behaviors and some of those mindsets that we actually were trying to change in the first place. And for me, it was around enforcement of certain school rules and certain school policies that I felt were, were both considered deeply normal and deeply much a part of the way we do schooling here in Aotearoa. This is to say nothing of the school in particular. It was just, we have school uniforms and we enforce school uniform policy. But when I saw the type of impact some of that enforcement had on young people and the role that I was playing in the enforcement of those uniform rules, it really starts to rub up against the kind of values that you hold as a person. And plus I had my own kids, and I knew that I could either continue doing what I was doing and sit with a degree of discomfort around some of that stuff, or try and find something new. And I think, a lot of us stay in jobs longer than we probably should, because we can't quite pluck up that courage, or we're not quite sure what to do next. And so I was really lucky that an opportunity presented itself for me to do a bit of a career pivot and go in a different direction. And yeah, it was. I'm so grateful for my time in the kind of education system. It taught me so much. It really catalyzed my passion for social justice, and yeah, it was a 8 years of memories that I'll cherish.
Red, you would have seen. So by the time you went teaching, social media was well established and lots of kids were using it. And obviously there's a lot of concern about the impacts of that. Was that something that you saw a toxic effect from when you were teaching?
Oh, I mean, definitely. And I think there are people much smarter and more well versed in the latest research than myself to kind of speak to that. But yeah, it's such a challenge, eh? How do we both give our young people autonomy and create spaces where they can develop social skills and test boundaries and make mistakes without the catastrophic consequences that we can see through the harms of digital technology. I think it's such an important conversation that we should be having as a country. And you can see the likes of Australia, and I think Canada recently passed social media bans for teenagers. And I think, whether or not that's the right approach, I'm not sure, but it's definitely a conversation we should be having a lot more kind of rigor and substance than I think we're having at the moment. So often we look at kind of digital technology stuff, and I think in New Zealand we have a tendency to apply a bit of a boogeyman lens to it all. There are some sort of nefarious, murky individuals in the dark web or something that are out there, but actually it's so much more common, it's so much more pervasive, and it does require all of us to play our part in having that conversation. So yeah, I think the mental health of our young people is too important to put at risk like this.
So tell me about the career change, the new opportunity that came up that led you to move from teaching.
Yeah, so one of my really good friends, Eddie Royal, runs a phenomenal creative agency called Curative, which really specializes in using the power of storytelling and comms and marketing for social good, to shift how we think and feel about some of our crunchiest social issues in Aotearoa. So I was really fortunate to work there for about 5 years in a variety of different roles, met some phenomenal people, learned so much, and got to dabble in the world of kind of comms and marketing for a little while, which is a really nice pivot from teaching 4 or 5 classes of 30 teenagers a day. I really felt like I was living the dream, and very much was, and somewhere along the way we got to work on a really special project, and it was a project that was led by the Human Rights Commission, Te Kahui Tika Tangata, and at the time Paula Tesoriero was the Disability Rights Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission, and she wanted to do a piece of work that shifted attitudes towards disability in Aotearoa, because we know all too well that disabled people are too often at the bottom of all the lists, right? You know, the education outcomes, the well-being outcomes, housing, employment, health, you name it, we're kind of at the bottom of that particular statistic. And so Paula's kind of thesis or idea was, if we can shift the attitudes and beliefs and assumptions that people have about disability, then maybe we can go some way to shifting some of those outcomes and shifting some of those statistics as well. And I think, you know, that was fun. That was absolutely the right approach to take in terms of that brief. And so Curative, you know, when I was working at Curative, we were lucky enough to get that piece of work, and we did a really substantial piece of co-design around that problem. So how do we shift attitudes towards disability? Well, first of all, we've got to understand what are the attitudes that exist right now, you know, towards disabled people and disability in Aotearoa. Who holds them, and where are those potential levers for change? You know, if we know things are bad, well, how do we start to shift the way we think about, in quite an ingrained way, an entire group of people, you know, which, according to our own statistics, represents somewhere between 20 and 25% of the whole population. And so we embarked on this co-design journey, and we learned a bunch of things through that process. And two of the ones that really stick out to me is that the first is that the thing that makes the biggest difference in terms of relationships to attitudes towards disability is relationships. So we heard that, you know, if you know disabled people, or if you're in relationship with disabled people, you're much less likely to have negative, kind of hold negative attitudes or beliefs or assumptions about disability. And so we knew that relationships was a really critical kind of part of this jigsaw. The second thing that we heard was that disabled people are so sick of being the kind of poster people for awareness raising campaigns. You know, we've been doing disability awareness for a long time, and we could argue that you know, there is still some more awareness to raise, but there was a real desire from disabled people that we spoke to actually have community spaces to come together. You know, there was a real need for us to tell our own stories, to be the architects of our own narrative. There was a real appetite to kind of reclaim the ways in which disability is spoken about in the media. So again, to credit my friend Philip Paxton, he often talks about the 3 T's of disability storytelling. He talks about the way in which the media often talk about disability in terms of tragedy or trauma or triumph, so triumph over disability. And we, you know, in this co-design journey, we really heard an appetite from disabled people to reclaim the way in which our stories are told and the way in which our communities gather together. So actually what we ended up doing was we went back to the Human Rights Commission as Curative, and we said, look, we know you want a campaign that shifts attitudes towards disability, but actually, what if we created kind of actually a community organization? What if we created a bit of a hub for disability culture in Aotearoa? What if we really kind of invested in and backed and supported disabled people to kind of be the architects of storytelling, of community gathering, of activating in different ways that celebrate just how amazing and diverse and brilliant our disability communities can be. And so to our delight, the Human Rights Commission said, that sounds like a great idea. And that kind of led to the emergence of the D list. And so, you know, to cut a really long story short, Eddie at Curative gave me her blessing to essentially depart Curative and to be part of setting up and establishing the D list as an independent, disability-led charitable trust. And so that's where we are today. And it's, you know, it's been an amazing journey over the last 3 or 4 years to get to this point. But I think, yeah, I'm really proud of the journey we've been on, and I'm really looking forward to the work we're going to be doing in the future.
I saw when I was doing the background research for this, the way you'd taken on stuff about the way that they had written about disability, you know, being confined to a wheelchair, etc. And it was just, one of those moments of insight you have in your life, and you thought, wow, like how often have I seen that? And I've never questioned it. You buy into a worldview that's shaped day in, day out in lots of tiny ways, and things like what you read in the media or what you see on television and the way people are talked about really sets expectations, and challenging that, that was really interesting. So tell me about the D-list and what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's such a good point you raise about the way in which our conditioning often is invisible to us, right? Until we see it done differently, and then we go, oh, that's much better, or whatever. So I think that's the experience a lot of disabled people have, is we see our communities and our people reflected back at us in ways that just feel really incongruent with how we see ourselves. It's kind of like, I've described it before as feeling kind of gaslit by the media, because it's actually like, knowing lots and lots and lots of disabled people myself and being in communities with disabled people, the way in which we are is not at all reflected in the stories that are told about us. And that's just because of conditioning, right? We are taught that disability stories look a certain way, disabled lives look a certain way, disabled people look a certain way, right? Even the fact that I use a wheelchair, I'm super conscious that there's a real privilege in that, because when people see me, they go, okay, I clocked that. There's a wheelchair. They might need a ramp, but I kind of get it, right? I get it. A wheelchair, I understand that. But there are so many, impairments and conditions and disabilities in our world that aren't as visible, and where people have to really go out of their way to explain what they need. And so, part of our work at the D-List is to simply make our stories and our communities and our people more visible, to really amplify the voices and experiences and realities of disabled New Zealanders, and doing that in a really strengths-based way, where disabled people are telling our own stories. And I think the other piece to this is telling our stories in a way that's kind of designed for a disabled audience as well. So what we're not doing is kind of pleading to the world to let us in, right? We are simply proud to exist, and we are simply here, and we are sharing our lives, and we are sharing our realities, and we're kind of having a bit of fun along the way. We're taking the piss where we can, and we're poking fun at kind of norms and institutions where we can. And I just think, that word I used earlier is like unapologetic. We're just trying to be a little bit more unapologetic, so that whoever is looking wistfully at their older peer with a straw in their wine glass doesn't have to feel quite so alone in the world, right? Because they can turn on the D-List and they can see there are other people that look like them and experience the world like them, doing all kinds of amazing stuff. And maybe that helps them feel a little bit less alone. And that's a real privilege to be doing that kind of work.
Final question is about the change you want to see, and I think you're clear on that. I kind of understand that from what you've said. What makes you hopeful? It's one of those great questions, I know, but it was one of the things, when we thought about this, there's so much going on in the world that's so depressing at the moment. And, we pick up our courage, and we look forward, and we hope. And so it's interesting to know how people frame that for themselves and for the community that we live in.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday was International Day of Disabled People, and at the D-List we hosted a community portraits day, where we had a disabled photographer here and in our community space, and they were taking pictures of anyone who wanted to come through and get their portrait taken, because in disability spaces we're often we're often not photographed at all, and when we are, it's often through a particular lens and in a particular way. And so we had community come through, and our space was chocolate full all day, from the time we opened the doors to the time we closed them at around 6:30 at night. And for me, it's days like that that give me hope, because I think I never cease to be amazed by the kind of energy, the laughter, the tears, and the kind of solidarity that is expressed when communities come together like that. And I think, like you say, there is plenty to feel kind of wary of and weary of in the world right now, both locally and internationally. And I think for me, the thing that gets me through will always be the kind of companionship, the kinship, the solidarity of our disability communities. And I think for such a long time, we've kind of been siloed or segmented by the very medical approach that New Zealand takes to disability. We tend to think about disability not as a kind of large and vibrant and diverse community, but we tend to break it up into, you know, blind folks over here, deaf folks over here, people who might use wheelchairs over here, people with learning and intellectual disabilities over there. And we haven't done a very good job historically of bringing those different kind of groups together. And I think that's what I really felt yesterday in terms of the event that we held here. But also what gives me hope for the future is just like bringing people together, people who have historically been marginalized and siloed, and just saying, you're welcome here. You know, whether you are ready to drink wine out of a straw or not, irrespective of your diagnosis or your impairment or your funding stream or any of the ways in which our communities are divided by government. You know, we just want to be a space for everyone. And I think to me, that will always be the thing that gets us through, right? All each of us want in the world is to feel a sense of connection and belonging, and like we're part of something. And for a lot of disabled people, that's often something that we have to work really hard to find. You know, it's not a natural path that we are shown. We are often the very opposite of those things. We're excluded. We are shut out. We are, you know, it's really, there are barriers in place for us to participate, attitudinal barriers as much as physical ones. So I think, yeah, community gives me hope, relationships give me hope, and young people too. Like, man, how cool are Rangisahi? And I think they're going to save us. So yeah, the future's in good hands. We're going to be okay.
Fred, thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure, honestly. Thanks for the great conversation.